Amit Bhaduri is an economist and a consistent critique of mainstream nomenclature, mainstream neoclassical economic theory, relentlessly exposing its logically flawed foundations. His research spans several important fields, including capital and growth theory, Keynesian and post-Keynesian macroeconomics, and development economics. His contribution as an economic theorist lies in challenging the mainstream theory in a precise and yet compelling way, bringing even into formal analysis the role of power in the analysis of the market economy. Some of his writings have been translated into several major European and Asian languages. Currently, he is internationally selected professor in Pavia University. He says it's not the situation currently, so it has become part of history now. And currently, he is professor emeritus in the Center for Economic Systems, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Over to Professor Amit Bhaduri.
Well, my purpose in this lecture would be to start with giving you a broad, what I think is the essential background to understand where we are and why we are there, through a kind of broad interaction of history, economics, politics, and so on. Well, let me to start with, you see, when India became independent, the anti-colonial nationalism of the, Gandhi period and so on, naturally had begun to dwindle soon after independence. It began losing momentum. But like in basic physics, in politics also, ideological vacuum is not tolerated, cannot continue for long. Some other form of ideology has to take up. And the ideology which took over in the case of anti-colonial nationalism quite naturally was the idea which is today we call a kind of developmental nationalism, developmental state, developmental nationalism, of largely proposed by people like Nehru, and it was put in the framework of a socialist pattern of society. This is history now. Whether it is true, how far it achieved it, how far it was meant to achieve something is a different matter, but this is the ideological replacement of straightforward anti-colonial nationalism gradually through our 5-year plans and so on. Now, in the process, I think there also emerged something very interesting which you might not know and which is beginning to echo in the Indian context today. When this developmental nationalism and the notion of a state-led industrialization, socialist pattern and so on was being propagated, at the same time there was another voice which was less hard at that time but which is becoming more and more prominent now, and that is the voice of Ambedkar. Because you see the difference between Ambedkar and Nehru, if you read some of the literature and writing of that period, of these two people, you will see there was a very interesting difference which you can very easily see. Nehru was talking about, Nehru and developmental nationalism even today, was talking about development in the economic sphere in which the state would be very proactive, the state would be very active, but the state would pass legislation and so on in the social sphere, but the social sphere was sort of, would automatically adjust to the economic sphere. The base would adjust to the superstructure kind of business without using those jargon. Now, on the other hand, there was Ambedkar, who was in many ways, because of his training and because of his own understanding, was much less of in favor of the state intervening in the economic sphere. He had studied in America, he had taken over that kind of liberalism, and he was very much against it. But Ambedkar, unlike Nehru, was adamant on the other thing, that there should be a very strong state, proactive state in the social sphere, partly because of his own background, because he had seen the caste oppressions and so on. So you see here at the very beginning, you had an ideological divide in which was partly at times much stronger, at times less and so on, but which was basically that the most active energy of the state should be given in the economy. That was represented by people like Nehru, Mahalanobis and so on, and by Ambedkar on the other side, that the most active intervention by the state and the most energy of the energy of the state should be spent in social reform. It is not that neither side minimize the importance of the other. I mean, this is not my point. But the emphasis certainly was very different among the two thinkers. Now, this difference gradually, well, India continued more or less under leadership of Nehru, who had the political power, or who represented the main political power, and Ambedkar gradually became less important, not as an idea, but in terms of the day-to-day politics of the country. India went along with the state-led a model of industrialization which was largely state-led, and in which India achieved something, did not achieve something. Very briefly, if you look at the report card of that period, say roughly up to the mid-60s, late 60s and so on, Nehru's date a little later. If you more or less look at this, the report card is quite striking, looking back as a historical piece, and when we come to modern time. The report card was, in the political sphere, both Ambedkar and Nehru were of the same view, and which was also very similar, that a kind of multi-party parliamentary democracy, which was not a given at the time of independence, but which actually India succeeded. And unlike most of Europe, if you leave out England, unlike most of Europe, which actually after the Second World War at a much higher per capita level of income, approximately $3,000 approximately $3,000 at the modern 1995 constant dollar price. But anyway, at $3,000, Europe started on what you call today's multi-party universal adult franchise democracy, one adult, one vote. In India, this was far, far less, about 1/7, and it was a tremendous achievement on political achievement and on the political front. On the economic front, it was also equally clear that it was a big failure in terms of removing poverty. Poverty not only was there and very slowly removed, but poverty continues even today, and on various estimates and so on, you can say somewhere between 1/3 and 1/4 of the people are desperately, subhumanly poor. But at the same time, India also had other economic performance which were not great, but which are not too bad by international standard. India had on an average during this whole period something like 3.5% growth, and most importantly, India had a growth rate of employment at that low growth rate of 3.5%, which is much higher than today. It was about 2%. Regular jobs grew at something like 2%, while output grew at something like 3.5%. Well, if you compare it with today, it is 7% average growth, somewhere around 7% average growth, less than 1% employment growth. So it is not very clear that we have been so much succeeded unless you just look about GDP growth. Now, these were, so on the political front, India can be considered to have got what it wanted in terms of its success. In the economic front, it can be said to be, in terms of removing poverty, a bad failure. In terms of growth and employment creation for that period, it was not a grand success, but it was not a desperate failure either. But less apparent remains what I started by saying, the difference between, that is why I emphasize the difference between Ambedkar and Nehru. Less apparent was the strategy which the Indian government followed during this period, which was neither just a question of democracy, political democracy, multi-party system, nor a question of what is your GDP growth rate and what is your employment growth rate, was a third element, which was really the fault lines of the Indian society, the different kinds of divisions in the Indian society, which Ambedkar had emphasized caste, somebody else could have emphasized language, somebody else could have, it could have been emphasized different things. Somebody else later emphasized gender, somebody else emphasized, regional differences. It can go on. India is a tremendously, in the normal language, India is a tremendously diverse country. In another way of looking at it, India is a country where you have all kinds of crisscross of fault lines, any of which could create an earthquake. And it did. For example, in the 1950s, the linguistic division of the states. During the Mandal Commission, it was some, so-called OBCs coming to power. So anytime one of these things can be exploited and is being exploited. So there is this kind of division, which is neither a classic class division of the traditional type just based on income, but on the other hand, this remained a part of Indian society all along, whether it is the Nehru period or it is the Ambedkar debate and so on. Going through this narrative a little further, of course, things took a fairly dramatic turn around the early 1990s. This was going on, this 3-4% growth, with employment gradually slowing down, but still around 2%. But things took a dramatic turn around 1991, which we today call neoliberalism, liberalization, whatever name you want to give, heavily market-oriented policies. But the crux of it, of the 1991, was it was largely driven by a crisis, and it was not so much an ideological embrace, which governments later, Manmohan Singh and so on, later tried to make it out to be. It fitted in very well with the globalizing world. India had a desperate foreign exchange crisis, and this is when actually liberalization became a kind of imperative for the Indian system. At least that is what the policymakers thought. This 1991, which was to a large extent a crisis-driven response to a foreign exchange crisis in a globalizing world, resulted in two basic changes from which actually today's story starts. Today's many of the problems we see, many of the politics we see, many of the changes we see, which starts. The first was, we had, as we all know, and which is every time anyone who reads a newspaper or has any contact with the media cannot escape, is India had an unprecedentedly high growth rate by previous standard. 3% average became something around 7% average, which was about 2 times the world GDP growth rate. And everybody started saying that, yes, you see, we have got out of the liberal, Inspector Raj, and we have arrived. It will very soon give and so on. The second element was it was also something which ideologically very beautifully fitted in with both in India and in China with a globalizing world. In the background of a globalizing world, it seemed natural to liberalize not only a domestic market, but to make bigger contacts with the outside world through trade, investment, so on and so forth. And this was meant, in one sentence, it meant far greater emphasis on the foreign market than on the domestic market, which was not true in the earlier period. That you actually got a big shift of emphasis from that, we produce from outside, we produce for outsiders than we produce for insiders. We have to be successful exporters, not successful in terms of producing what the poorer Indians need and so on and so forth. Now this was the real change, two changes which came over, a much higher growth rate and a shift in the emphasis in favor of the foreign markets rather than the domestic market. What is said very little, and which was initially only a few people like us with very little statistics, I must admit, to be intellectually honest, we mostly said things very often with stray evidences rather than very systematic data. But very soon, given our gut reaction that this was not exactly the right thing, many of us started saying, but this is increasing inequality. Not only corruption and so on, but this is increasing basic inequality in the society. Now of course the evidence is indisputable. I mean, I don't want to say we are right, we said it, as I said, instinctively, but gradually it became quite clear that there was something in this high growth regime which was actually creating greater and greater inequality. Now, greater and greater inequality means two things. I mean, when you read a newspaper, it means rich becoming richer, poor becoming poorer. The distance between the two are growing. It is a little bit more subtle than that. What it means are two things in the Indian context. There are a large number of people below the, what you call the poverty line, who are extremely subhumanly poor. They don't get the minimum income for a human existence. For these people, throughout, from the period 1950s, there has been a decline. There has been a decline. Decline has been very slow, but the number of people who are below the poverty line has, by all account, has gone down. But what is not true, that during liberalization, it is also now quite clear, what is not true is this decline became much sharper under liberalization. It didn't. It continued, it more or less continues at the rate at which it is. But this is about absolute poverty, so on and so forth, which has almost World Bank has made into, from the time of McNamara, into a big industry. Every economist actually works on not on inequality but on poverty. How many people are poor, count the poor this way, that way, so on and so forth. You can do it in many ways, but basically it is true. You only have to have open eyes to see. India remains a desperately poor country. You see it less in Kerala. You go to East India, you go to Bihar, you go to UP, and you won't have to be told that it is a country where somewhere around 1/3, 1/4 are very, very poor. Almost anywhere in North India. Now, poverty is different, at least in the jargon. Poverty is different from inequality. Inequality is the distance, the difference between the rich and the poor. For example, the poor are here, the rich are here, the poor might go up a little, the rich might go up here. So the distance between them would have increased. So the poor need not become poorer, the rich becomes richer. A very good example of this is China today. In China, almost everybody's income has increased, poverty drastically reduced, there is no doubt, to about, now they say, according to their official statistics accepted by everybody, somewhere around 8% or less. while India has somewhere around 30%, this way, that way, 4%. But what has increased is dramatic inequality both in India and in China. As they liberalized, both of them got a tremendous increase in the distance between the rich and the others. The rich became much, much bigger and so on. Now, to give you only a few, not statistics, but a few sort of impressionistic figures about, impressionistic figures not of mine. Much of this is research, some of this is not researched very well. But to give you some figures, what exists is one of the studies which is by two Frenchmen, which is, who did the biggest study, and it became, a big, almost international news, called Capital in the 20th Century. Some of you might have even heard of it, by Piketty. Now, Piketty and another Frenchman, Sacha, they together wrote an article called From the British Raj to the Billionaire Raj, and for the first time used income tax statistics in India to say what has happened to income distribution. Now, income tax statistics has one problem: only maximum, actually it is around 4%, but maximum 10% of the people would in any way be involved in paying income tax, the family, directly or indirectly. 90% of the people have nothing to do with income tax in a country so poor as this. So basically what they had to do for the poorer people, the 90%, they had to use what is called their consumption figure of what they consume, do not consume, etc. That data with the richer people, the top 10%, their income. And they found something using this, which is probably the most solid systematic work which is done on income inequality. They found something which is quite interesting, that till the income tax statistics, the income tax returns begins in India from 1922, and their whole studies from 1922 to 2012. They found income inequality was somewhat high in the 1930s and so on. These were the days of the British and the Maharajas. So obviously it was a little bit higher, but still around 10-11%. Then, that is the top the top 10% got about something, the top 1% got about something like 10% of income and so on. This actually during the late period, which I was talking about, before liberalization, late 1970s, 80s and so on, early 80s, this came down to 6%. This was the lowest that the top 1% of Indian population held. But then somewhere between 1990, and this is not politics, this is actually fairly detailed and done by two people who have nothing to do with left-wing politics, coming down to about 6%, it shot up to 22%. And some people now say, including Piketty himself, that it is probably still higher in India. But this is a gross underestimate, that this sharp increase in poverty during this period of the 1990s to today, that where the top 1% own something like 20%, 22-24% of the national income, is a sharp underestimate. Because income and income tax return, which is habitually understated income of the rich people, the income is no measure of your actual status. Status in the, I don't mean social status, but your actual income status, because it is wealth. I mean, rich people actually don't, Mr. Ambani and I would be much closer in terms of income than Mr. Ambani and I would be in terms of wealth. Mr. Ambani would be holding anywhere between, 50,000, 60,000 times more wealth than I would. But Mr. Ambani still, income-wise, would be in the range of hundreds with me. Because this is income is a very conservative indicator of differences in people's actual status in terms of wealth. Now, the wealth data is much more difficult to get, and there is some data which you can get from various sources. The first, I'm not going to give you the data, but I'm going to give you what I basically want you to say before I come to why it happens like this. That the income data, the wealth data given out by Credit Suisse, their research wing of the bank, the Swiss Credit, their data, which basically says that wealth by the top 1% around the year, let me see so that I don't make a mistake, yes, around the year 2000 was 31%. Okay. This has shot up. Their last year is 2014, wealth data. That 1%, top 1% of the Indian own 55% of the wealth. Okay. More than half the wealth of the country is owned by the top 1%. The other data, which is given out by the, what is it called here? Not Progress. Again by Credit Suisse, and now there is a Chinese one, which is called Hunan Watch. These two have given out some data, and I tried to some extent to reconcile, to the extent possible, this kind of data from two different sources. That within limits, you can roughly say that what has happened is not only these wage differences are there, but there is something which is happening in India and in China, which is something which is almost never noticed, never talked about. That is, when growth takes place, suppose you had already today India's income was 100, okay? A 10% growth takes place. So India's income becomes 110. So the increase in income, which we will call in jargon the incremental income, the increase in income is 10, okay? Now this increased income, this increased wealth is much more badly distributed or much more unequally distributed than the original income. That is, the 100 was, say, divided between you and me 50-50. But this 10 would be divided between you and me. The increased 10 would be divided between me. You will get 9, I will get 1. This is so continuously, it is at the margin, at the increment, it is becoming worse and worse. So if you take today, it is worse. If you take 5 years later, if this trend continues, it will be much worse and so on. With the result, today you see it started after the old Soviet system broke down and so on. Russia became the typical country where through privatization and so on and so forth, a new class of rich were created. But today, according to this Hunan and the Forbes, which does the rich world income study, what has happened is America, of course, is the most unequal country with this kind of unequal distribution, which has sharply increased during Trump's time, the little data we have in the last 1 year. But number 2, where income inequality is, this distribution of wealth this distribution of wealth at the margin is very bad, is Germany. And the third one is China. The second one is China. The third one is Germany, and the fourth one is India. That is, India has overtaken all other countries like, Russia and so on, and very, what we call the very corrupt countries, Nigeria and so on. India, somewhere in the mechanism of Indian growth, like in the mechanism of Chinese growth with liberalization, there is this inherent tendency to increase the degree of inequality. Piketty and so on have given the data, and there are other people who have also given similar data. But actually in economics, at least certainly in standard economics, the conventional economics, you do not have a good explanation of this. And I want to tell you, after looking at some of this, not an economic, but what actually is likely to happen, and what can probably explain this kind of a tendency of why inequality continuously increases with growth. For this, we have to see where the inequality starts. I mean, what has happened? Well, where it started is relatively simple. In 1991, we shifted from a state-led model of industrialization, call it whatever you like, but a model of industrialization, a model of development, growth, and so on, which largely emphasized only the economic aspect and said that the state will play the major role, right? From this whole pattern was the main agent of growth and industrialization became the large corporate sector. Because under globalization, it was automatic, because if you are a small, let us say if you own a small shop in Kerala, you cannot really compete globally. I mean, it is quite obvious you cannot compete globally. So there has to be, you don't have the network, you don't have the, either the supply network or the demand network or the market chain. So basically, globalization actually meant corporations playing a very big role. Okay, so that was automatic, and the government realized that if globalization would mean strengthening them. In a place like China, it was state-owned corporations. In India, it was partly state-owned, but much more it was privately owned corporations which would do this. And in America and so on, it is this giving over the main responsibility of development to large corporations basically meant what? The government will have to support this process by following policies. Some of these policies were already there, some of these policies already goes back to the Nehru period, but in less pronounced form. For example, you hear all the time about the wastage from standard economists in the TV and so on. You hear the wastage by giving subsidy to the poor. So I took up the challenge. I took the last 14 years budget data and tried to see how much subsidy in the form of tax breaks and so on is given to the rich. And there is another person who in a different way, looking at Indian agriculture, did the same thing. I mean, I have only read one of his pieces, Dhirendra Sharma. Basically, my figure is a little bit different from his figure, but basically it looks like that the subsidy which was given to the poor, including all these employment guarantee, employment guarantee scheme, food subsidy, whatever other subsidy there is, everything included, it is roughly comes to approximately 4.5% of GDP on an average. If you take from 2002 to 2014-15, the last year of the data. If you look at the same for the tax breaks and in subsidies given to the large corporations, it comes to the same, almost the same order of magnitude. It is 4.4% of the national income. That is, both of them. I mean, you hear all the time about the subsidy which is being given to the poor, but this is a subsidy. But this is not new. This is there from the 1960s onwards. This has been going on. It has slightly increased, but it has been always there. Now, the second thing is, which you hear less about, but which is now becoming, after some scandals and so on in the banking sector and so on every day in the newspaper, is the subsidy which you give in the form of lenient bank loans to large corporations, and for which the bankruptcy law and the, property attachment bankruptcy laws are extremely weak and not enforced for whatever reason. So basically this becomes a subsidy which is now calculated, it's stock, but it is calculated at something like 10% of GDP, somewhere between 8 and 10%. So 4% every year you give on the basis of 4 to 5% you give every year as subsidy. You give bank loans which you would not get back, and you give it still because you think that this is the way to promote corporate investment. If India has to industrialize, just like earlier we believed that, if the state has to industrialize, there will be certain kind of wastage connected with the state. Now it is assumed that there will be certain kind of wastage connected with the corporations, so the corporations would steal some money, we'll take some money from the banks and so on, and you have to allow this. I mean, that is the unwritten, that is, of course, nobody is allowed to say it. But this is the second element by which you try to incentivize and promote corporate investment. The third and the most important element, I think, which is a more recent one, is your natural resource policy. That is, you change, I mean, what is called the water, the forests, the mountains, the rivers, all of which actually require access through land and common property of the, which used to be the common property. These you take from the government takes from the people, and government acquires them either as land acquisition, or the government already owns them in many cases as common property in the villages. And these are handed over at an extremely cheap rate, at a throwaway price to corporation, so that they would industrialize. There have been some very interesting studies, one by somebody called Aditi Gandhi. I have not met her, but I have seen. She did it with another man called Michael Wallen. I think he's a professor of sociology or something in Harvard. The two of them wrote 2-3 papers in which they almost unambiguously showed that the number of rich people in India who have joined the rich club, really rich club, each and every one of them almost in the last 10 years have something to do with a large amount of property being, natural resource being transferred in their favor. The most obvious and recent example is Adani. Now, this thing is brought out, it can be tallied against what you see in this fashionable Forbes magazine, which produces every year, it's a magazine which basically promotes fashion and, how the rich live, so on and so forth. But it also gives some data on the number of rich people, quite well researched. And there is the Hunan study, which also does the same thing now, has started doing the same thing now. They provide some remarkable statistics. And that statistics is as late as 1995. India had only 2 persons who were on the, what they call the high net individual, individuals of high net worth. That is the, basically the dollar multi-billionaires. There were only 2 of them who had that kind of income and wealth. In 2012, by 2012, that is roughly from the early years of liberalization to 2012, where it was sort of well underway, there were 52 people, far exceeding the number almost anywhere else except China. China also has started producing dollar multi-billionaires at the same rate almost. And then by 2014, India had, as I said, after America, China, Japan, and this poor country is in the 4th place in the world in terms of the dollar multi-billionaires. Okay. But this is not the whole story. This is only part of the story. What is now becoming clear from, what is not transparency, the World Financial Integrity, which actually challenged some of the Swiss bank accounts and so on. They published some data when they got, and they showed that on a rough estimate, to the extent you can estimate such a thing, on a rough estimate, the total wealth of these very rich individuals, today the number is said to be 99, just about 100 in India. These very, very high net worth individuals. These people, their total wealth, somewhere close to 300 billion, which is only about the illicit wealth outside the country, what we normally call black money, and which Mr. Modi, Prime Minister Modi wanted to bring back when he first said that everybody will have 15 lakhs in their, It was at that time, it was made very clear that the wealth which has gone out is somewhere estimated by this Transparency International 2.5 times the wealth which these people own in the country. Okay, so obviously a lot of money has gone out permanently, or I mean, Nirav Modi is just a symbol which you are reading right today. You will read some more tomorrow. Now, the issue which arises, these are descriptions. This is what has happened. What has happened is growth has increased, employment has not increased, or increased very little. Growth has increased quite dramatically, the biggest critic of the government would say, in terms of output. But what is it that is keeping inequality increasing at such a high rate? What is there? Is there something inner in the mechanism of the country? This is where I think I began to think and reread some of Ambedkar and Nehru debate and Ambedkar's debate with Gandhi, so on and so forth. And I think you begin to see something which is not entirely my own theory, I'll mention later. But I think you begin to see something which is quite different in this. I'll give you examples later, but let me first say what it says. This is a theory which exists in almost many subjects. It does not only exist in economics. It is where the social, economic, and political reinforce each other. Okay? Now, in engineering, you call it a strong, positive, mutual feedback system. The three strongly interact itself. In physical chemistry, you call it the explosive autocatalysis, system of autocatalysis. Autocatalysis is catalysis is the thing which makes the chemical reaction faster. But there are some very special chemical reactions which produces catalysis in the process, which makes it even faster. And this is actually when some of the most explosive systems express. In economics, we call it increasing returns. And Gunnar Myrdal, first looking at American relations and so on, called it the cumulative causation, cumulative circular causation, a rather big name, but cumulative circular causation. What it basically means is that you have inequalities of different, say economic inequality reinforcing social inequality, social inequality reinforcing political inequality, political inequality reinforcing social inequality, and this spiral becomes stronger and stronger, bigger and bigger. Now, this is a theory which I think we should take very seriously, and I just want to give 2-3 examples in the short time which I have to say what I mean, rather in terms of concrete common sense examples, and then end by saying so. My first example is, take the case of at the level of the individual. I'll give 2 examples. Take the example of an individual. Say, for example, typically land is acquired, and a high probability that land would be acquired in the area where there is possibility of natural resources or water or forest or something like that. Most of these areas, because of traditional reasons from earlier times, were regions where Adivasis lived. Okay. We know from Indian statistics now, by putting together various statistics, that on an average the Adivasis who are 8% of the population have been displaced. Of displaced population, they are 40%. People who have been dispossessed by being thrown out of their land is 40%. So the probability that if you are an Adivasi and the land is being taken away is about 5 times more than, say, Amit Bhaduri being displaced. I mean, Amit Bhaduri is even less, but somebody else being replaced is a normal individual almost with no privilege, but living in a city would be much less than 5 times more for an Adivasi. A similar calculation for Dalits would be 3 to 1, 3 times more. So it does not fall equally on everybody. These are the people who would be more affected. So you lose your land, you lose your livelihood. And now I speak from an actual experience which was taught to me. Then an Adivasi tells you that, well, I said that, but you will get compensation. He said, well, when should I get compensation? I have to live for 6-8 months, before I can even think of a job. And then he called me back. This was through an interpreter. He called me back and he said, not only would I, I'm almost putting it in short sentences, clearest sentences, that my language, which is Gunda, who will understand it? Who will give me a job? Who will give me a job this was in Chhattisgarh? Who will give me a job in the city? Because they will not understand me. I will not understand them. And this is true. We have a lesser of this among the Santals. There are many. So this linguistic division, on the basis of which linguistic states were created in India and so on, comes back to when you have lost your land and when you have lost your livelihood, your possibility of getting anything is much lower. With the result, you become much poorer. And with the result, as you become much poorer, not only in the next generation, but in this generation, the difference between the same Adivasi who was very poor and somebody who got the land, which is a large corporation, the difference increases. This is a very clear example of how the inequality goes up from actual experience. Now take a second example. The second example is let's take a woman, gender discrimination. A woman almost anywhere in North India will not, even if she, after the change of law and so on, even if she technically inherits the land, she will not operate the land. The land will not be actually in her name. The banks will not give loan against her name. It will be through a male relative that she will get it. Okay. The classic case of this, which we came across, was in Bihar, rather in Jharkhand. Got the land, then she was not allowed to cultivate it. When she was not allowed to cultivate it, obviously her income fell. She sold off her cows and so on and so forth. And then very soon she had to leave the village. She could not live in the village because she was a high caste. The opposite case of this in the same village, in Bihar, not in Jharkhand, in Ada, we came across the opposite case, a Brahmin woman. This is exclusion and inclusion in modern jargon interacting. A woman, Brahmin woman, who is included in the upper caste. And because she is included in the upper caste, as a Brahmin woman, she is not allowed to cultivate land. Okay? Or she is not allowed to even go out and supervise the cultivation of the land herself. She has to do it through somebody else. So, as a woman, she is included as a Brahmin in the upper caste. She is excluded as a woman from cultivation. With the result, her condition was miserable, from what she said. Now, these are the various reinforcement mechanisms which at the individual level takes place. I think at the political level, the reinforcement has taken a form which I think is now anybody who wants to see can see it, is very clear. In this competitive race of democracy, every party needs money to fight elections. Bigger political parties need the election, the Democratic Watch calculated from affidavit, 30 to 40 crores. So they will need that money. Smaller political parties, including Aam Aadmi Party, including everybody else who talked against corruption and so on, including left parties and so on an average spend 8 to 10 crores on a parliamentary election. Now, if they have to spend it, where would they get this money? And from the affidavit, do we now know? They cannot get it. I mean, if you calculate it, although they say that this is how our wealth is increased, they cannot get it through this less than 20 rupee provision by the people. So the simplest way, or not the simplest, the most effective way in which parties collect fund is by having a natural resource policy where corporate would be favorable to corporations, corporations would give them money in return. It's across the political line, it has become a part of competitive democracy. And this is where you see the reinforcement mechanism from democratic politics to, democratic politics to inequality being generated in the process. And I do not have to add that to this, the present regime in power in Delhi, that is, not in the center, the present regime in power wants to add a redefinition of nationalism, which will further increase these divisions. Thank you.